and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. President Joe Biden and President Yoon Suk-yeol unveiled the Washington Declaration, a new plan to counter the North Korean nuclear threat. The U.S. pledged to strengthen its nuclear umbrella protecting South Korea, and South Korea signaled it would not develop nuclear weapons. Today we discuss what this means for the alliance.
Nuclear attack by North Korea against the United States or its allies or partisans or partners is unacceptable and will result in the end of whatever regime were to take such an action.
상대방의 선의에 기대는 가짜 평화가 아닌 압도적인 힘의 우위를 통한 평화를 달성하기 위해 양국 간 확장 억제를 획기적으로 강화하기로 했습니다. Our alliance is for justice. Our alliance is for peace. Our alliance is for prosperity. 군사 안보 동맹으로 시작한 양국 관계를 공급망, 첨단 과학기술 동맹으로 발전시켜 양국이 함께 성장하고 행동하는 동맹으로 만들어야 합니다.
In the studio with me, Ambassador Mitchell Reiss, partner at the Brunswick Group, where he leads the firm's global geopolitical practice. Ambassador Reiss was the Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and the President's Special Envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. Also joining us, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and served as a CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Klingner, President Yoon addressed the joint meeting of Congress, and during his 46-minute speech, he mentioned freedom 43 times. What was most notable about his speech?
Well, I think overall, I thought it was a masterful speech. He covered the history of not only the alliance, but even before that, the overall relationship, and talked about the sacrifices America made on behalf of Korea during the Korean War, which plays very well to Congress and American audiences. But he also showed really the expanse of the relationship today, economic, business, trade, security, it goes on, and also showed the need for both of our countries to work in conjunction with others to defend freedom and democracy.
Now, Ambassador Reiss, during President Biden's term, only Greek Prime Minister and Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed the joint meeting of Congress. How prestigious is this occasion, and how is Washington receiving President Yoon's speech?
Well, I think it really was a triumph for South Korea and the entire South Korean people. It really demonstrates the growth of South Korea over the last few decades to its position as a leading power, a leading influence in the world, as Bruce mentioned. So again, I think the idea that he mentioned freedom so many times really reinforced the idea of shared values between the Korean people and the American people. So I think it was very well received, and I think it's a good harbinger for future relations.
Now, Mr. Klingner, Presidents Biden and Yoon announced the Washington Declaration, in which they launched the Nuclear Consultative Group. And President Yoon said this is totally different from the past in terms of implementation. And NSC spokesperson John Kirby told VOA that this is brand new because it's really focused on nuclear capabilities and any potential use of nuclear weapons. How is the NCG different from the existing Extended Deterrence Strategy and Consultation Group?
Well, I'll be honest and say I'm not sure. And I think I'm not the only person who may be a little uncertain. I think not only other experts, but perhaps even U.S. and South Korean officials. A lot of it's going to be very sensitive and not disclosed because it's dealing with nuclear weapons. But overall, it clearly is intended as an elevation, a formalization of a South Korean role in U.S. nuclear planning, nuclear decision-making. The U.S. retains full control of those weapons, but clearly, because of South Korea's role in the Combined Forces Command and our overall relationship, I think the U.S. has responded quite well the last couple months to South Korean concerns and complaints that the U.S. wasn't being transparent enough in our nuclear strategy. So the U.S. responded to that, or now we are bringing South Korea in to a much greater degree, though we may not be certain of the details of how those groups will work.
Ambassador Reiss, a senior U.S. official said the NCG will not decide when to use nuclear weapons. He also added that the decision for nuclear use is the sole authority of the President of the United States. So even with the NCG, isn't South Korea still blocked from participating in the nuclear decision-making process? And also, South Korea's presidential office said that this is like nuclear sharing, whereas White House NSC says this is not nuclear sharing. Are the two sides already interpreting this differently over the same agreement?
Well, I think all of those statements can be correct, and I think people are putting different interpretations to them for their domestic audiences. So I'm a little bit more positive than Bruce is. I do think that this symbolically was extremely important. As Bruce says, it was the United States being responsive to the concerns that we've been hearing out of Seoul, not just for the last few months, but for a little bit longer time than that. The decision-making will remain the United States, but there will be shared consultations, shared discussions whenever possible. That's certainly a step forward in terms of South Korea's involvement in these issues. And we'll have to see how it evolves. But it's trying to reassure South Korea, the South Korean people and government, that the United States is a credible ally. And Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has used the phrase software and hardware. The software is these types of person-to-person consultations. The hardware is going to be submarine visits and other ways in which we can physically, visibly show South Korea that we will continue to provide extended deterrence.
So you said Washington was being responsive to the public opinion in South Korea. And do you think this was a smart move by Washington to proactively address the growing calls in South Korea to get their own nuclear weapons?
I think it was a very intelligent and thoughtful and measured response to a changed situation, not just domestically in South Korea, but North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missile capabilities continue to grow. And let's not forget that China has now undertaken a robust nuclear modernization program. So the environment in which South Korea finds itself and the United States finds itself in the Pacific is evolving, and I think that this was a step forward to recognizing that.
So on top of the South Korean public opinion, plus President Yoon Suk-yeol's public comment back in January about developing nuclear weapons as a policy option, were these trigger for United States to provide unprecedented level of extended deterrence to South Korea?
Well, I think that these discussions were taking place privately before the public statements. I think they probably accelerated that conversation, and I think that they resulted in the Washington Declaration that we just saw.
Now, Mr. Klingner, upwards of 70% of South Koreans want to get their own nuclear weapons. If such public opinion persists, even after the Washington Declaration, then will Washington again come up with some stopgap measures whenever such sentiment flares up?
Well, I think this may be an evolving process. And if I think of sort of three lanes in the road, there are the outside non-government advocates for South Korean nuclear weapons. And they won't be satisfied until they have a huge South Korean nuclear inventory of their own. The South Korean public, is 71, 76% who are in favor. When there are polls where the consequences of South Korea developing nuclear weapons are explained to them, the public support goes down considerably. So I think there's been sort of, polling that doesn't quite capture the enormity of the issue, including the consequences. And then the third lane is the South Korean government, which President Yoon has made several comments in January and October 2022, and quickly walked himself back, or senior officials walked him back. So the government was the least in favor or least advocating of nuclear weapons. And now we have Seoul clearly saying they are very satisfied, they are very reassured with the U.S. extended deterrence guarantee. And by affirming their commitment to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the U.S. South Korean Civilian Nuclear Agreement, they firmly closed the door on an indigenous nuclear weapons program.
Critics in South Korea say that the Washington Declaration put nuclear shackles on South Korea. And there is also South Korean public opinion which have skepticism over the durability of U.S. extended deterrence commitment to South Korea. How should Washington address these concerns?
Well, South Korea could go nuclear, and then they will face a cutting off of all fissile material production or deployment or providing. And then South Korea would lose 30% of its electricity production. If they test a nuclear weapon, which they would have to do to have a viable deterrent, that automatically triggers the Glenn Amendment, which the U.S. would have to cut off military and economic assistance, et cetera. It sort of goes on and on. It's pretty clear right now Seoul does not want to go down that path. I think also both the U.S. and South Korean governments have to have a strategic messaging initiative where they explain how South Korea is better served with greater interdependence with the U.S. military and extended deterrence guarantee rather than greater independence from the alliance.
Now, Ambassador Reiss, even though NCG is established, if a future U.S. president does not want to get involved in nuclear exchange with North Korea, wouldn't paper promises be of little value?
Well, paper promises do have some value. Public declarations have value. The 28,500 American troops that are stationed in South Korea, along with the 200,000 civilians, clearly have value. And 70 years of shared history, not to mention the blood that we spilled together in the Korean War and Vietnam War and elsewhere around the world, all speak to the closeness of this alliance. So I don't think that it's feasible, viable, or prudent for the United States not to respond should South Korea be threatened. But the United States needs to do a better job of reassuring South Korea that we will be there, that we're a credible and reliable ally, regardless of who's president.
Now, Mr. Klingner, if a future South Korean president reverts back to strategic ambiguity between Washington and Beijing and reduces military cooperation with America and relies on North Korea's goodwill, in such circumstances, will Washington have confidence in running the NCG and sharing sensitive information with South Korea?
Well, I'd say over the 70 years, the alliance has gone through ups and downs. We've had sometimes strained relations over differences of view or actions by Washington or Seoul, and the alliance has weathered all of them. If we have a U.S. or South Korean president in the future doing irresponsible actions, that certainly will strain the alliance. But I think beyond the presidents themselves, there is a very high U.S. public support and South Korean public support for the alliance, the presence of U.S. forces, and certainly a very strong bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress for the alliance. And that's we've seen repeatedly, including in statements in the defense bill where they've stipulated there is the 28,500 troops there have to remain at that level as a signal of our determination to live up to our agreement to defend South Korea.
U.S. officials said that strategic nuclear weapons will not be deployed to South Korea, whereas NATO has nuclear weapons. So wouldn't the NCG be less effective than NPG?
There are differences between the two organizations. I don't think it makes military sense to put tactical or strategic nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. It'd be taking them off of very hard to find, very hard to target nuclear delivery platforms and putting them in a static bunker, which is a very high value target for a preemptive North Korean attack. It's much better to leave them on the hard to target platforms, and that way North Korea doesn't know where they are, they can't target them, and therefore I think it's a much more effective deterrent and defense than putting them, it's like taking the bullets out of a gun and putting it back at police headquarters. you've degraded your capability rather than increased it. And now if you were to say, well, it's time to put the bullets back in the gun or put the missiles back on the airplanes or submarines, well, the people might say, well, you can't do that, that's escalatory. So then you've sort of locked yourself into a permanently degraded deterrence capability.
Are European countries more vulnerable to attacks from other countries because they have nuclear weapons then?
Well, I think there are a lot of differences, sort of geographic differences in history. You know, things that were agreed to decades ago in Europe, I don't think would necessarily play out the same way now. So, you know, nuclear sharing, it refers to 5 NATO nations have aircraft where they can deliver U.S. weapons, but it always remains U.S. weapons. U.S. retains the authority over their use, over whether they're use or non-use. So I think in some ways South Korea thinks the nuclear planning group is more than it is. So I think in many ways the nuclear consultative group, I think, will be perhaps even stronger because of the nature of the Combined Forces Command, where I think it's much more integrated, even with plans for a South Korean general eventually to be in command of that, you know, than the relationship with Europe.
Can I just add, there's a precedent from the Cold War, which is after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States removed its missiles from Turkey, the Jupiter missiles. And the Turkish government was worried about extended deterrence for the same reasons, perhaps, that some South Koreans are. And what the United States did is it sent a nuclear-armed submarine to Turkey, and it said, we're going to be basing this submarine in the Mediterranean, and this is going to be our visible presence, our visible expression of extended deterrence for you. And the Turkish government was reassured. And so I think that is what is happening here, and I think it just needs to take a little bit of time for people to get more comfortable with that. So extended deterrence is real, and as Bruce says, it's actually more survivable and therefore more stable. Strategic stability, crisis stability, certainly. So I think this is a very good outcome.
Now, Mr. Klingner, President Biden lauded President Yoon for his courageous and principled diplomacy with Japan, saying that his actions has strengthened trilateral cooperation. Is the Biden administration seeking to include Japan in the new nuclear consultative group? Is that why President Biden made a point to appreciate President Yoon's recent actions to resolve the history dispute with Japan?
I would see those as separate. Certainly, President Biden and other U.S. officials and other U.S. experts saw that President Yoon's outreach to Japan, which he had said he would do during the presidential campaign, you know, is very courageous, and it's also politically risky. So, you know, you have to appreciate a politician who does what he believes in, even if it's going to come at a political cost. And since his outreach, we've seen Japan responded with removing export controls, moving towards putting South Korea back on the export white list, a lot of resumption of military and economic and business meetings, which had been on hiatus for 4 or 5 years. So it will improve the bilateral relationship as well as trilateral security coordination, which is in South Korea's as well as all of our countries' interests. I think the nuclear consultative group will expand to include Japan, and I also think Australia. I think that makes sense because those nations are going to be firmly working together along with other UN command sending nations to provide support and defense to South Korea during a conflict.
Ambassador Reiss, is U.S., South Korea, and Japan's security alliance something that United States would want? There are some concerns in South Korea about that direction.
I don't see any reason why there should be any concerns. I think that the alliance has worked, again, for many decades. It's worked well. As Bruce said, President Yoon's courageous stance to reach out and to try to resolve some of the differences with Japan, I think, can only make that alliance stronger. And again, the environment in the region is changing. And so it's becoming, in some ways, more threatening. And that argues for allies and friends to bind together because we're much stronger together than we are separately.
Now, Ambassador Reiss, during President Yoon's trip to Washington, what did America gain the most? What are deliverables for America?
Well, I think there were a number of bilateral agreements that were signed, so there's some economic benefit. But I think the number one thing that the United States should take away from this is a greater appreciation of South Korea as a loyal, valued ally that not only shares our interests, but our values for human rights and freedom around the world. And so I think it elevated South Korea's estimation in the eyes of the American people. And as somebody who's been traveling to South Korea for the past 40 years or so, it was very gratifying to see that.
So was Seoul less appreciated before?
Well, that's a glass half full way of answering, responding to the question. I think there's always been many of us in the United States that have appreciated everything that South Korea has done for and with the United States. I just think that, again, with South Korea's growth, maturation, I think there's many, many more Americans, and as Bruce said, there's strong bipartisan support for this relationship.
Now, Mr. Klingner, during President Yoon's state visit, South Korea has secured $5.9 billion in investment from 8 U.S. companies. What does this tell us about the evolving alliance from security alliance into economic security alliance?
Well, it shows the continuing trend that our relationship is much more than the alliance. As critically important as the alliance is, the relationship is much broader. I think for many Americans who don't follow Korean or Asian issues, they just think of terms of history and the alliance. But I think this week's visit really shows how expansive the relationship is. As President Biden said, Korean companies have invested $100 billion in the U.S. in the last 2 years, and we've seen additional business deals, and we're going to continue to see that over time. And also in President Yoon's congressional speech, as well as the other interactions between the leaders, we've seen really it's business, it's trade, it's security, it's diplomacy, it's supporting democracies, not only in Indo-Pacific, but European with Ukraine. It really is kind of, mind-boggling almost how involved the two countries are with each other on such a wide range of issues. So I think this week was very successful in, highlighting that relationship and that brotherhood, and hopefully point out to a lot of folks who aren't as familiar with Korea the importance of defending Korea against the North Korean and Chinese threats, and how, in the words of the alliance, 같이 갑시다, we go together.
Mm-hmm. And when we look at the breakdown, Ambassador Reiss, $1.9 billion was from 6 American high-tech companies, and then media giant Netflix also invested $2.5 billion in South Korea. What does this tell us about South Korea's strength as investment destination?
Well, I think it speaks very well of South Korea's attractiveness as an investment destination, and also because of the creativity, the academic accomplishments, the intellectual and business accomplishments of the South Korean people. So it's a very attractive pool of talent, not just South Korean talent, but global talent, people that can be successful anywhere. And I think American companies want to tap into that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Klingner, Presidents Biden and Yoon, in their joint statements, that the two leaders appreciated the recent efforts to address South Korean companies' concerns over the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act, and they also committed to future consultations, but they stopped short of providing any specific rescue measures. Why was that?
I think it's still a work in progress. As Korea has pointed out, the Inflation Reduction Act is not compliant with the World Trade Organization. It's not compliant with the U.S.-South Korea Chorus Free Trade Agreement. So the U.S. has heard that message, and I think has taken some steps to address those concerns, just as we heard the concerns about the extended deterrence guarantee, the viability of it. So I think the U.S. government has responded to some degree. I think there's more that can be done. We need to have a greater emphasis on free trade than protectionism, particularly when we're dealing with such good friends and trading partners as South Korea.
Ambassador Reiss, there are still remaining concerns from the South Korean companies regarding the IRA and the CHIPS Act. Do you think there is a determination on the U.S. government to address this issue?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Bruce said. I think he's exactly right. So this is something that is worked out best in private among friends, not publicly. I hope that we can do that. We have a lot that we can gain by working together. So I'm optimistic, but there's more work that needs to be done.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Klingner, Ambassador Reiss, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.